Managing the Managers. James Burnham.
In all societies of any size and complexity, there must be persons who perform the managerial function. In earlier eras, this function was performed by those who by virtue of heredity, property rights, military prowess, or priestly skill held positions of power. In contemporary times, the development of managerial groups has gone beyond anything achieved by previous societies in relative numbers, power and privilege, and the degree of autonomy with respect to other social groups and classes. A more important development is a shift in the basis of managerial power. The divorce of control, or power, from ownership has been due in large part to the growth of public corporations. So long as a single person, family or comparatively small group held a substantial portion of the common shares of a corporation, the legal owners could control its affairs. Even if they no longer actually conducted the business, the operating managers were functioning as their accountable agents. But when the enterprise became more vast in scope and, at the same time, the stock certificates became spread in small bundles among thousands of persons, the managers were gradually released from subordination to the nominal owners. De facto control passed, for the most part, to non-owning management. This structural shift was not limited to large-scale corporate business enterprise. A parallel shift took place within the other great institutions of the advanced nations. Within the governments, the power of the elective parliaments began to leak to the bureaus, executive agencies, commissions and commissariats. As I wrote in the Managerial Revolution, in the new form of society, sovereignty is localized in administrative bureaus. They proclaim the rules, make the laws, issue the decrees. The shift from parliament to the bureaus occurs on a world scale. The actual directing and administrative work of the bureaus is carried on by new men, a new type of men. It is, specifically, the managerial type. The active heads of the bureaus are the managers in government, the same, or nearly the same, in training, functions, skills, habits of thought as the managers in industry. Within the huge trade unions, a similar managerial officialdom, the labor bureaucracy, consolidates its position as an elite. This elite is sharply distinguished in training, income, habits and outlook from the ordinary union member. The trend extends to the military world, the academic world, the non-profit foundations and even auxiliary organizations of the UN armies are no longer run by fighting captains, but by a Pentagon-style managerial bureaucracy. Within the universities, proliferating administrators have risen above students, teaching faculty, alumni and parents, their power position expressed in the symbols of higher salaries and special privileges. The great non-profit foundations have been transformed from expressions of individual benevolence into strategic bases of managerial administrative power. The United Nations has an international echelon of managers entrenched in the Secretariat. There are fairly obvious parallels in the managerial structures of the diverse institutional fields. For example, managers in business are to stockholders as labor managers are to union members, as government managers are to voters, as public school administrators are to taxpayers, as university and private school administrators are to tuition payers and fund contributors. As their de facto control spreads, the managers begin to coalesce as a potential class, and take on distinctive psychological and cultural as well as economic and political traits. These become the natural object for comment in books, such as William H. White's The Organization Man, C. Wright Mills' The Power Elite, Milo Vangelis' The New Class, David Granick's newly published The Red Executive and the business novels of Cameron Hawley. The traits are remarkably uniform in all advanced nations, whatever the official form of the regime, communist, socialist, fascist or capitalist. The managers, like all other social groups that move up in the world, find that an increase in power makes both possible and seemingly an increase in privilege. There are typical managerial methods of appropriating the privilege. In business, there is the delicate manipulation of bonuses, stock options and rights, delayed compensation, merger windfalls and the like. In every institutional field, alert managers explore the potential of annuities, pensions, holidays, fringe benefits and, above all, the expense account. First-class accommodations in aircraft, ships, luxury hotels, clubs and restaurants, as well as large, black chauffeur-driven limousines, are some of the privileges enjoyed by managers who need not pay for their use. Luxurious necessities. These perquisites are necessary in order to fulfill the job of managing in our society. They are just as necessary to a government bureau chief or trade union official as to a corporation or university president. As a matter of fact, they are so necessary that the corporation or bureau or trade union often owns and operates the aircraft, resorts, restaurants and big black cars. True enough, the modern managerial caste is not yet as fully solidified in its power and privilege as some landowning, patrician and priestly classes have formerly been over periods of centuries. The managerial group is more open and fluid than these, at least with respect to individual members. But it is young yet. Even today, though individual managers in business can lose their jobs, a Napoleonic campaign is needed to get rid of a corporate management group. As for government or educational administrators and trade union officials, a nuclear explosion would hardly be enough to dislodge them. If we are willing to believe the ideological apologists of the managers, there is nothing wrong with this situation, and we should rejoice at having entered a rationally administered age of peace and enlightenment. Still, some analysts think they see a few flies in the ointment. Once the managers consolidate their position within an institution, their objective interests no longer fully correspond to the interests of the other groups involved: voters, owners, members, teachers, students, or consumers. A decision on dividends, mergers, labor contracts, prices, curriculum, class size, scope of government operations, armament, strikes, etc., may serve the best interests of the managers without necessarily contributing to the well-being of the other groups. Unrestricted managerial predominance tends to be socially wasteful and thus inflationary. This tendency has been formulated by Professor C. Northcote Parkinson into a series of laws which emphasize the well-known empire-building trait of managers, their tendency to expand work to fill available time, and to expand expenditures to use all available and borrowable funds. Managerial activity tends to become inbred and self-justifying. The enterprise comes to be thought of as existing for the sake of its managers, not the managers for the enterprise. A high percentage of the time of the managers and their staff is spent on housekeeping and other internal problems. Self-justifying managerial control tends to keep alive operations which have little social purpose other than to nourish an enclave of managers. This is conspicuously true of governments. Many acute, expensive problems which our society faces, for example, in agriculture, radio, TV, railroads, finance, etc., are largely manufactured by the managerial agencies founded to solve them. Managerial predominance tends toward regimentation and the suppression of active democracy. The rising power of a managerial group in a given institution is, in fact, usually equivalent to a lessening in whatever form of democracy is relevant. In other words, the power of the stockholder, voter, member, consumer, faculty, taxpayer, etc., decreases as the power of the manager increases. The combination of managerial groups, as when there is collusion between labor and business management, means the decline of democracy in the conjoined fields. In this connection, we must remember that totalitarianism is nothing more than an integrated front of managerial groups achieved either by mutual agreement or unilateral coercion. Managers are not, in short, accountable. This question has, in the last year or so, begun to preoccupy many analysts in Europe, especially in Britain and West Germany. Granted the best will in the world on the manager's part, what objective factor can direct their performance toward the public interest? Who can manage the managers, and how? Discipline of the market. If we don't like the way the managers manage, we are told, we need only exercise our democratic rights as stockholders, voters and union members. The advice has some merit, no doubt, but the managers have a big head start in any contest with the unorganized, formless mass of their constituencies. The managers have learned techniques for manipulating their constituents to their own purposes and even for getting their constituents to imagine they like being manipulated. The 95% vote by which stockholders approve an outrageous stock operation grab by their management, or the vote by which union members rename a treasury-draining thug as their president, or the people's vote in a nominating convention or plebiscitary election, none of these can be said to represent a real choice made by the people. It is argued that in a business enterprise the managers are subject to the discipline of the market. If they run the enterprise too badly, it will go bankrupt, and the managers will sink with their foundering ship. There is in truth a discipline of the market, and this is why business despots are less noxious than government despots. But the market can discipline only when it is free. Invasion of the market's freedom, whether from tariffs, quotas and subsidies, government commissions, management union collusion, cartel and trust arrangements or managerially administered prices, inevitably lowers its disciplinary power. This is just the reason, incidentally, why the managerial revolution has everywhere been correlated with a decreasing freedom in the market. Power versus power. In the political realm, discipline must also involve a possible loss of job and privilege. This means a kind of political free market, with a vigorous opposition plus a revival, particularly for the upper echelons, of the spoils system, at least insofar as it means rewards for good service. This is the reason why the progressing managerial revolution tends to eliminate the spoils system and to sterilize or altogether get rid of the political opposition. In this way the managerial positions are safe from being challenged from within the organization as well as from without. In the trade unions, law and custom have done away with all analogues of market freedom. The managers are, in reality, no longer accountable to anyone in their own field. Effective pressures can be brought against labor managers only by other managers of business, government or perhaps other sectors of the labor movement. This last observation applies more generally. In all fields, the managers are gaining predominant power, and it is utopian to suppose that we can do very much to restore effective control directly to the constituents, stockholders, voters, members. Only power can check power. Managerial despotism, with its totalitarian potential, can only be combated if the interests of the managers in one field are sufficiently different from the interests of managers in other fields. We will, that is to say, bring to bear within the new context of managerial society our traditional doctrine of checks and balances, separation of powers and diffusion of sovereignty. Within each major field, business, labor, education, government, we must try to keep vigorously alive an anti-monopoly principle, suitably adjusted to our social structure. We do not want the sameness of one rigid, organizational structure to control business, labor, education and government. We need, instead, the living variety of organic nature in the makeup of these institutions. This concept must extend to relationships among the various fields. The managers of business need not concern themselves about whether their type of management corresponds to the interests of managers in government or labor. The trade union managers must make their bid in their own way for workers' allegiance and public support. The managers in governments should recognize that the educational, business and social interests of the citizens can get along without governmental advice every step of the way. Finally, the directing managers of each nation should preserve a healthy remnant of national individuality from becoming dissolved into the global managerial state that looms, under a variety of labels, as the ideal goal of a total managerial society. The only way to manage the managers, in short, is to keep them busy enough managing or countervailing each other to guarantee that they won't unite and spend all their time managing the rest of us.